You are intelligent, you are capable, and yet you cannot, for the life of you, send that freaking email or start that project or begin that workout, even when you desperately want to. Hey there. Welcome to another episode of ADHD and with Jorie Houlihan. I am Jorie Houlihan, your guide for the dopamine deprived, ADHD life coach, speaker, and fellow late diagnosed ADHDer. Today we are talking about something that probably brought you here in the first place, that invisible wall between you and starting something. You know the feeling. The task is clear, you have the time, you have the ability, and you might even have the motivation. But there's this barrier, right? This thing that sits between your intention and your action. And for women with ADHD, that barrier has a name, and that name is the activation wall. Here's what I know about you. You are probably successful. You've built a career, managed a household, maybe even raised kids, all while operating without the instruction manual for your own brain. You are intelligent, you are capable, and yet you cannot, for the life of you, send that freaking email or start that project or begin that workout, even when you desperately want to. And if you have spent the last decade or three thinking that meant you were lazy or unmotivated or fundamentally broken, I'm here to tell you you are not. You're wired differently. And once you understand how your wiring actually works, everything changes. Everything. In this episode, we are going to demystify the activation wall. We are going to talk about the neuroscience behind why starting is so hard for ADHD brains. We're going to look at examples of what this might look like in your life. And most importantly, we are going to give you practical, evidence based strategies that work, not because you white knuckle harder, but because they work with how your brain is built. By the end of this, you will understand that the activation wall isn't a character flaw, it's neurology. And neurology can be worked with. So let's dig in. First things first, what exactly is the activation wall? Activation dysfunction, that's the clinical term, is the neurological difficulty in initiating action. Even when you have the intention, the ability, and sometimes even the motivation to do the thing, it's the gap between, I know I should do this, and I'm actually doing this. Here's the key distinction, because I think this matters. This is not procrastination. That's a different thing. Procrastination is avoidance plus anxiousness about a task. You're anxious about the task, so you avoid it. That's procrastination. But activation dysfunction, you're not avoiding the task because you've become anxious about it. You're stuck before the anxiousness even kicks in. You literally cannot cross the threshold into starting. And it's definitely not laziness. Laziness is the lack of motivation. You don't care about the thing. But with activation dysfunction, you do care. You want to do it. You've decided to do it, and your brain just won't turn on to do it. Think about what this looks like in practice, right? You might be someone who can't start your own projects until they're due, the next day. But if someone else needs something urgently, you're on it immediately. You're like a different person. That's the activation wall in action. If you are hearing this and thinking, how did you know this about me? You're not alone. This is one of the most common patterns I see in my clients and live with myself. Now, why does this happen? There are three main reasons, and they're all neurological. So let's talk about them. The first one is dopamine dysregulation, the one we all know and love, right? ADHD brains have lowered baseline dopamine levels than neurotypical brains. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that helps you initiate action, feel motivated, and experience reward. It's what gives you that sense of accomplishment. And here's the thing. Starting a task requires significant dopamine to cross what we call the activation threshold. Think of it like this. Imagine that you are getting ready for a big event. You know exactly what you need to do. You need to shower, get dressed, do your hair and makeup, etc. For someone without ADHD, it's like they have a full charge on their phone. They can move through all the steps with no problem. However, for an ADHD brain, you start with about 40% less charge. You can shower, but now you're already depleted, right? Getting dressed takes more energy than it should. So by the time you think about hair and makeup, your battery might be nearly dead. Again, you're not lazy. You're not unmotivated. Your system just started with less juice to work with. So when you are sitting there staring at your inbox, unable to open the first email, that is not weakness. That is your brain's dopamine system working as designed for an ADHD brain. You are starting with a lower charge. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Finishing tasks or doing urgent tasks releases dopamine, which is why ADHD brains often work better under pressure. You get to the deadline, your brain releases dopamine, and suddenly you can move. You might stay up until 2 a.m. the night before something is due, but you get it done. And that is actually not a moral failing. That's just your brain getting the dopamine spike it needs to activate. And fun fact, research shows that individuals with ADHD have significantly lower dopamine availability in the areas of the brain associated with motivation and reward processing. And even when we complete a task, we don't even really feel a sense of accomplishment. We feel more relief it's over because the dopamine that we do get from it just takes us up to where everyone else is like baseline. Reason two, executive function and working memory. Activation requires you to hold a bunch of information in your head at once. You need to remember the task itself. You need to think about the steps involved. You need to know where your materials are. And you need to get yourself physically set up. That is a lot of working memory. ADHD brains have reduced working memory capacity. The mental load of just preparing to start something can exceed the cognitive resources you have available. And when that happens, your brain does what it does best, which is shuts down. Not consciously, of course. You're not choosing to shut down. Your brain is literally running out of processing power. I think of it like trying to run too many browser tabs at once, right? Your computer starts to slow down at first, and then it freezes, and then it crashes. Your brain is doing the same thing, except you're blaming yourself for the crash instead of understanding that you just opened too many tabs. Reason three, time blindness and urgency bias. This one is a little sneaky because it explains so much about how ADHD brains prioritize, but it's also very subtle sometimes. So without external urgency, all tasks feel equally distant and equally unimportant to ADHD brains. So an example would be the email that's due tomorrow feels the same as the email that's due next month. Your brain doesn't perceive the difference, which means your brain doesn't generate urgency for either of them. Isn't that fun? And without urgency, there's no dopamine spike. And without the dopamine spike, there's no activation. Urgency is one of the few things that can reliably trigger dopamine release in an ADHD brain. Initiating tasks that don't have immediate consequences is one of the most commonly reported challenges for adults with ADHD. So if you're sitting there thinking, yeah, this is me, you're in good company. Really good company. This is what this could look like in real life. You know you need to send an important email. You might spend 2 hours doom scrolling instead, though. Why? It's not because you don't care about the email, and it's not because you're procrastinating in the traditional sense, but because your brain hasn't generated enough activation energy to cross the threshold. Or you have a full day to work on a project, and you don't even open the file until the night before. And then suddenly, with the deadline looming, your brain releases dopamine and you work for 4 hours straight and finish the whole thing. Or you want to exercise. You know exercise is good for you, especially if you have ADHD. You want to do it, but you cannot move from the couch. That is not laziness. That is activation dysfunction. I have spent my entire life thinking I was lazy, struggling to get started with things that I really wanted to do. And I thought maybe I just don't want it bad enough. And that wasn't the case. It was activation dysfunction. And here's the thing that I think is really important. A lot of you are high achievers. You are successful. You have built careers and lives that look good from the outside. And that means that you have developed sophisticated workarounds for activation dysfunction. You manage activation dysfunction through external deadlines. You know, your job provides those. You manage it through crisis management that you have kind of created yourself because you wait until things are urgent to start them. You manage it through last minute heroic efforts. You pull all nighters and somehow pull it off. You hyperfocus on things that genuinely interest you. And because you have managed to be successful despite all of this, you probably convinced yourself for a long time that you couldn't possibly have ADHD. You've convinced yourself that your struggle doesn't count because you got the work done eventually, right? But that's not what success looks like for everyone. And it's exhausting. And it doesn't have to be the only way. Now that we understand what the activation wall is, let's talk about what's actually happening in your brain when you're standing in front of it. The main players here are your prefrontal cortex and your anterior cingulate cortex. These are the brain regions responsible for initiating action and switching between tasks. They are your brain's go button, if you will. In ADHD brains, these regions are under functioning. Now, I want to be really clear about something. These regions aren't broken, they're not damaged, they're not missing, they're just under functioning. It's like the difference between a car that's broken down and a car that just needs a higher voltage to start. The car is fine, it just needs more power. And this is important because a lot of women I work with have spent decades thinking that their brain was broken. I thought my brain was broken. It's not. It's just wired differently. So when you're trying to start something, your brain is essentially demanding more stimulation than you are currently providing it. That is why external pressure works. That is why urgency works. That is why novelty works. These things provide the additional stimulation your brain needs to activate. Let's talk about motivation, because this is where a lot of people get confused. The traditional motivation model goes like this. You have an intention. You feel motivated. You take action. Simple. So simple, right? Yeah. Simple, linear. Yeah. Doesn't apply to ADHD brains. Sorry. The ADHD activation model is different. You have an intention, and then there's a gap that willpower can't bridge, a gap that motivation alone can't cross. And then you need something else: external pressure, urgency, novelty, challenge, feedback, any of those things to trigger enough dopamine to activate. And only then can you take action. This is so important to understand because it means that willpower isn't the answer. Take that word willpower, throw it away. Not doesn't work for us. Motivation, not the answer. Quote unquote, just do it isn't the answer either. These things work for neurotypical brains. They do not work for ADHD brains because they don't address the actual problem, which is insufficient dopamine to cross the activation threshold. Dr. Russell Barkley, who is one of the leading researchers on ADHD, he's amazing, has extensively documented how external structures, immediate feedback, accountability, time pressure significantly improve task performance in brains. And it's not because you're more motivated, but because external structures provide the additional stimulation that your brain needs to activate. And here's one other thing that I see over and over again with high achieving women: perfectionism. Perfectionism becomes the mask for activation dysfunction. You can't start the project because it won't be perfect. You can't send the email because you haven't found exactly the right words yet. You can't begin the presentation because you need to have every detail figured out first. Sound familiar? Perfectionism is the killer of dreams. If you can't start because it won't be perfect, you're using perfectionism to avoid the activation struggle. And the thing is that perfectionism feels noble, right? It feels like you're just maintaining standards, but really, it's keeping you stuck. Here is something else that doesn't get talked about enough, and that is the emotional component of activation dysfunction. Starting tasks triggers emotions that ADHD brains struggle to regulate. Being anxious about performance, perfectionism, overwhelm from complexity, frustration at past failures to initiate. And the list goes on. And for women, especially high achieving women, there's also shame, deep shame, because you have internalized the message that if you can't just do the thing, there is something wrong with you. Women with ADHD report higher levels of anxiousness and perfectionism than men with ADHD. That means The emotional wall is often higher for us, and that is worth acknowledging because we have to work even harder to get over that wall. So now we understand what's happening. Now let's talk about what you can do about it. Oh, yay. Okay, so here's the thing, these aren't strategies that require you to be different. They're not. They are strategies that work with how your brain functions, which means they're more sustainable, unlike willpower based approaches that burn you out. Strategy one, lower the activation threshold. The goal here is simple, make starting so small, so simple, so manageable, so non threatening that your brain can't help but do it. We call this micro starting. And the key is don't aim to do the entire task, aim to do 2 minutes of the task. If you need to write a report, you're not saying, I'm going to write the report. You are saying, I'm going to open the document and write one sentence. That's it. That's all I'm committing to. And here's the magic of this. Most of the time, you don't stop at the one sentence. Once you've started, momentum carries you through. As I have said in previous episodes, most people think you need to have motivation to get momentum, but you actually need momentum to get motivation. Okay, regardless, the permission to stop after the one sentence is what gets you to start in the first place. Set a timer for 2 to 5 minutes, commit to just that time, give yourself explicit permission to stop when the timer goes off. And the truth is, you probably won't, but you need the permission. I do this with laundry, I do this with exercise. And I know this sounds almost too simple, but simple is kind of the point. Your brain doesn't need complexity, it needs low barriers to entry. All right, second strategy, create external accountability and urgency. Since your brain responds to external pressure, let's just create some, shall we? Tell someone you're going to do something by a specific time. Schedule a work block on your calendar and treat it like a meeting with yourself. You wouldn't cancel a meeting with your boss, correct? So don't cancel on yourself. Now, I know that I have done this and I have completely canceled the appointment with myself, but that is where using body doubling works. Use body doubling, which is working alongside somebody else, even if it's just on Zoom. Why does this work? Because external accountability creates urgency, and urgency triggers dopamine, and dopamine allows activation. It's not cheating, it's not weakness, it is strategic, and it is smart. It's working with your brain. If you have a big project, schedule specific blocks. Tell your partner, a friend, a coworker, whoever, I'm working on this on Tuesday from 2 until 4, and I'll text you when I'm done. Suddenly, you've created external accountability, and your brain has a reason to activate because you don't want to disappoint them. You don't want to look bad in front of them, right? And there are also apps and communities built around body doubling. I have mentioned them in the past. FocusMate is the one I use. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Virtual co working spaces where you just show up, other people show up, and you all work together. And just having another human in the space, even if you're not talking, can be enough to trigger activation. Strategy three, environmental and sensory design. So, ADHD brains love novelty and stimulation, right? So, let's give them some. Set up your environment the night before. Have all of your materials ready and visible. Eliminate competing stimuli. Close other tabs. Put your phone in another room, whatever you need to do. But also add novelty. Change your work location. Use background music or white noise or something along those lines. Stand instead of sit. Use fidget tools. Do something different. When your brain senses that something has changed, it signals, oh, this is different, and can trigger activation. So you're not being distracted by the novelty, you're using the novelty to activate. All right, think about your own experience with environment. Where do you find it easiest to work? And is it different from where you usually try to work? That shift in location, in sensory input, in novelty, that's what can trigger activation. You're not being distracted by the change, you're using the change to activate your brain. All right, strategy four, reframe and break down the task. Sometimes the task itself is too big. So we're going to break it down into smaller steps. Instead of write report, break it into outline, introduction, section one, section two, conclusion, however it works for you. Then focus on the first micro step only. You're not trying to write the whole report. You're trying to write an outline. That's less cognitively overwhelming, which means it requires less activation energy. You can also use time boxing. Not everybody loves it. I personally do. I'm going to work on this for 25 minutes. You can use the Pomodoro technique. That can be really effective for ADHD brains because the defined time makes the task feel manageable. I will also say this about the Pomodoro technique. While the traditional way of doing it is 25 minutes of work and 5 minutes of a break, you can make this work however you want. So if you actually work better going 45 minutes and taking a 10-minute break, that works too. It's more about giving yourself a defined amount of time. You just want to make sure you don't work too long before taking that break, because then it becomes much more challenging to come back from the break. The key is reducing the cognitive load of activation. The simpler the first step, the easier it is to take it. The last strategy, it's the last one, I promise. Leverage your hyperfocus. Here's the thing about ADHD brains is that they can hyperfocus. You know what I'm talking about. You get interested in something, and suddenly 8 hours have passed and you forgot to eat and go to the bathroom and hydrate. You get my point. So instead of fighting it, use it. Notice what naturally activates you. What creates enough novelty or interest or challenge, etc., that you can hyperfocus on it. And then see if you can build those elements into the tasks you struggle with. So if you struggle to send emails, can you make it a speed challenge, right? Can I answer 10 emails in 30 minutes? Suddenly it's a game. And games activate ADHD brains. I say this a lot. Gamify the shit out of things because that works wonders. If you struggle to organize your files, can you make it a puzzle? Can I create a system that's both functional and aesthetically pleasing? Now there's novelty, challenge, and creativity. All right? You're not lowering your standards, you're working with how your brain works. Now, I want you to pause for a second and sit with these questions. Okay? You don't need to answer them out loud or anything, but I do want you to actually think about them. First, which scenario resonates most with you? Are you struggling with self directed tasks? Do you feel paralyzed before starting? Do you need external urgency to activate? What does your activation wall look like for you? When you do manage to start something, what changes? What helped you to do it? Is it external pressure, a specific time, someone else was involved? Notice your activation triggers. That's really the first step to building your own activation system. All right, next question. What would become possible for you if you could reliably initiate tasks without waiting for crisis or panic? Which strategy from this episode feels most doable for you to try this week? Yep, I want you to try one of them this week. Is it the micro starting? Is it external accountability? Environmental design? Task reframing? Just pick one. One. Please watch out for all or nothing thinking here. I I have lived this. I want to do all the things and I want to have that all fixed by last week. It does not work that way, so just don't. Moving on. Have you been blaming yourself for activation struggles that might actually be neurological? What would change if you stopped seeing this as a character flaw? Your self talk. Your self talk will change. Think about those things for yourself and look at all of this through the lens of curiosity. When you are trying new things, when you're asking yourself these questions, be curious about them. No judgment is allowed. Judgment just brings more judgment. Curiosity brings answers. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The activation wall isn't a personal failing. It is not a character flaw. It's not laziness. And it's not a lack of motivation or weakness. It is a predictable feature of how ADHD brains work. It is neurology. And once you understand that, everything shifts because you can't change your neurology through willpower. But you can absolutely work with it. The women I work with who make the most progress aren't the ones who white knuckle their way through life. They are the ones who say, okay, my brain needs X, Y, and Z to activate. Let me build that into my life. They're not trying to become different people. I don't want you to become a different person. They are building systems that support the people they are. You have probably spent a lot of time and energy trying to force yourself to be someone who can, quote unquote, just do it. Someone who doesn't need external pressure. Someone who can start things without waiting for urgency. Someone whose brain works like a neurotypical brain. And that person does not exist for you. And I have been that person, and I still occasionally find myself doing that. But that's not how we're wired. And that's okay. I really need you to hear that part. It is okay. I need you to just internalize that. What's possible, though, is building a life that works with your wiring, where you use body doubling because it works, where you create external accountability because it activates you, where you change your environment because novelty triggers your brain, where you give yourself permission to start imperfectly because that's how your brain works best. The activation wall is real. Your struggle is real, but so is your ability to work with it. And I promise you, once you stop blaming yourself and start understanding yourself, everything changes. Start small this week. Start with one small strategy. That's it. Just one. Notice what happens. Be curious about it. And remember, you're not broken. I promise you're not broken. Okay. You're not unmotivated. You're not lazy. You're wired differently, and different can work beautifully once you understand it. Okay. I would really love to hear from you. I want to know which activation strategy are you going to try this week? So send me a DM or drop a comment on one of our latest posts. Tell me what happens when you give yourself permission to start imperfectly. It will feel weird at first. I'm not going to lie. It will feel weird, but you'll get used to it. Your experience might be exactly what another woman in our community needs to hear. You never know who you're going to help. And if this episode resonated with you, and I have a feeling it did, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with one woman in your life who struggles with starting. Reviews help us reach more women with ADHD who are ready for real solutions, not quick fixes. Real solutions. Thank you so much once again for being here and listening. I appreciate you more than you know. I will see you next week. And remember, stay curious.